My name is Major Lauren Hayes, United States Army, and the first thing I heard before the program began was my father telling a table of retired officers. She never fought in combat. I was 5 steps from the stage, close enough to smell the brass polish when his laughter blended with theirs. I did nothing. I didn't turn. I didn't speak. I let the words hang the way a flare does over a battlefield, bright, ugly, impossible to ignore. I knew the program order. I knew what was printed beneath my name. After the color guard and the anthem, the general would read a list that did not require debate dates, units, locations. Facts. Afghanistan. 3 tours. There are truths a room can argue with, and there are truths that land like a gavel. Mine was the latter. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the clean edge you keep sheathed until it matters. I stood at my aisle seat, hands at my sides, dress uniform pressed so sharp the light seemed to stand at attention on the ribbons. Around me, the ballroom murmured in that pre-ceremony quiet. I didn't need to see my father to see him. Retired Colonel Michael Hayes, Desert Storm. Ranger tabs in every photo. To his buddies, he was always 6'4", even when age trimmed the inches. To me tonight, he was the distance between rumor and report. Ellen, the coordinator, touched my sleeve. "You're up in 10 minutes, Major. You good?" "I'm good," I said and meant it. Families took their seats. A toddler dropped a toy car. The sound skittered and died. Veterans' events look like this pride dressed as humility. Grief pressed into a neat tie knot. Love disguised as posture. The MC did housekeeping. The color guard filed in. Everyone rose. The anthem turned the room into a single held note. When we sat again, my heartbeat stepped into a slower march. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC said, "please welcome Major General Alan Cartwright." He thanked donors, acknowledged spouses, told a brief story about a medic who kept a wounded private breathing with 2 fingers and hope. People laughed at the right spots and fell silent at the right sentence. Then he lifted a folder. Tonight, he said, we honor service that often speaks quietly and works in the dark. We begin with... Before he said my name, another line drifted over my shoulder. My father again lower now. She did hospitals, he told someone. Stateside. Never saw combat. Not like the boys. I did not turn. Here is the thing I will never say at a podium. I've been under mortar fire while stabilizing a chest wound with both knees on gravel. I've watched the world narrow to a pulse under my fingertips while someone's buddy begged me to make time stop. I've performed triage by headlamp when the generator died, and the night felt like a mouth closing. What you call combat depends on whether you think the fight ends at the trigger or when the bleeding stops. I know where my battlefield begins. Ellen brushed my sleeve. After the next name, she mouthed. The next name was a Marine gunnery sergeant. The applause rolled across the room in tidy waves. He stood, nodded, sat. Then the general paused the space. A man leaves before the word that matters. Major Lauren Hayes, he said, United States Army. Forward, surgical and field attachments across 3 combat tours in Afghanistan. Bronze Star for Valor. Combat Medical Badge, Distinguished Service in Operation Mountain Shield. If rooms could go weightless, this one did. I heard my breath. A dozen chins lifted from tables that had been listening with one ear. The facts were simple enough for a single page, but their gravity pulled everything into alignment. No adjectives, no argument, just coordinates and witness. I stepped into the aisle. Chairs scraped, legs straightened. A man I didn't know put his hand over his heart. A young soldier in dress blues lifted his chin in that earnest way pride makes. Up front, the general smiled a small amount at the corner of his mouth, which is how men like him say, "We see you." I passed my father's table without looking down. I saw him anyway, the tilt of his head, the calculation in his eyes, the way he reached for water and found there was none. I did not slow. On stage, the lights were warm. The flag to my right stirred with the breath of a vent. I saluted. The general returned it and we shook hands. "Welcome home, Major," he said quietly, like a line meant for one person. "Thank you, sir." They handed me a plaque. It was heavier than it looked. So are most honest things. If you're waiting for a confrontation, you'll be disappointed. I had chosen my weapon, and it was not a sentence. It was the list the general had read, and the room that had heard it. I stood with the weight of my service in my hands and let the facts finish the work my voice didn't need to start. When I stepped down, the applause didn't swell. It steadied. Respect doesn't always get louder. Sometimes it just holds. I took my seat again 5 steps from the stage. Somewhere behind me, a retired colonel considered the distance between what he'd said and what had just been said, and I found I did not need him to close it for me. That would come later, or it wouldn't. Either way, the record stood. The program moved on. Names, units, campaigns. Each factor rung on a ladder we had all climbed in different weather. In 10 minutes, I would stand again for a group recognition and face a wall of faces that for once looked the way the truth felt. For now, I sat still and did nothing, and it was enough. I was born into a house where service wasn't just a choice. It was the air we breathed. The walls were lined with shadow boxes, campaign ribbons, plaques that smelled faintly of polish even years after the ceremonies. My father, Colonel Michael Hayes, filled every room with his presence. Desert Storm, multiple deployments, a ranger tab that seemed to glow under the hallway light. He was the kind of man whose war stories were told standing up even in the kitchen. He could hold a room with details about a sandstorm in Kuwait or the sound of incoming fire. To his friends, he was a hero. To me, he was Dad, but a dad who measured worth in battles fought. My older brother Mark was always going to be the soldier. He enlisted right after high school, straight into infantry, and our father spoke about him the way other dads brag about their kids' scholarships. Mark's high school football trophies got replaced by framed photos of him in desert camo M4 slung across his chest. I was different. I didn't dream about carrying a rifle or clearing rooms. I liked science. I liked solving problems in controlled chaos. When I was 16, I took a first aid course and found myself fascinated by what the human body could survive if someone knew what to do in the right 60 seconds. When I told my father I wanted to be a military medic, he tilted his head like he'd misheard me. Medics are fine, Lauren, but you'll never see combat. You'll be in the back. He said it kindly, as if explaining the weather, but it landed like a limit. It wasn't just him. Extended family neighbors, even my guidance counselor framed my choice as support work. And maybe that's what lit the first slow-burning fuse in me, the idea that saving a life under fire was somehow less than taking one. At family gatherings, Mark was the center of gravity. People leaned in when he talked, laughed at his boot camp stories, asked when his next deployment was. I fielded polite questions about my classes, my part-time job at the library, and whether I was still doing the nursing thing. I learned to keep my ambitions quiet, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't feel like giving them away to be measured and found lacking. My father believed combat defined a soldier. I believed service did. And somewhere, I promised myself that one day I'd prove that belief in a way no one could dispute. That promise didn't make me louder. It made me deliberate. And when the time came, I signed my commission papers with a steady hand and no announcement to my family until the ink was dry. When my acceptance into the Army Medical Department Officer Basic Course came through, the letter felt heavier than paper should. I read it twice at my kitchen table before I called anyone. Dad's voice on the other end was polite, measured. "Well, that's a start," he said. "Let's see where they put you." Where they put me was stateside, a large military hospital with a trauma ward that saw the worst training accidents, vehicle collisions, and emergencies from nearby bases. I wore the uniform every day, but to my father, it wasn't the same. "You're not in the field, Lauren. You're in a building," he'd remind me, as if I needed the distinction. But I wasn't naive. I knew experience mattered, and that the path to the forward edge wasn't handed out like standard issue boots. So I volunteered for every slot that would get me closer to the line field training rotations, joint exercises with combat medics, late-night emergency drills that left me bleary-eyed but sharper. I learned to start IVs in the back of a moving vehicle. I learned to keep my hands steady while an instructor shook my shoulder to simulate explosions. I learned that when someone is bleeding out, seconds are worth more than rank. My father didn't see those moments. He saw my mailing address. Still stateside, he'd ask when we talked. For now, I'd answer because I knew something he didn't. The deployment roster was fluid, and there were always last-minute replacements. When the call came, it wasn't dramatic. My department head knocked on my office door and said, "Pack your bags. You're moving forward." Forward meant Afghanistan. Forward meant a forward surgical team, small, mobile, and very much in range of enemy fire. I was going not because someone handed me an opportunity, but because I'd made myself the person they could trust with it. The night before I left, I called home. I told Dad I was deploying. "You'll be in the hospital though, right?" he asked. "I'll be wherever they send me," I said, and left it at that. I don't know if he thought I was avoiding the answer, or if he simply couldn't picture his daughter anywhere but under a roof. But I could picture it: the tents, the dust, the sound of rotors at night, and I was ready to step into it. The commission was just ink on paper. This would be the proof. The first thing that hit me when I stepped off the C-130 in Kandahar wasn't the heat, though it felt like opening an oven into my lungs. It was the sound. Generators, rotors, distant gunfire that no one seemed to flinch at. It was a constant backdrop, like static, reminding you this place was alive in ways you couldn't see yet. Our forward surgical team was small, just a handful of surgeons, nurses, techs, and me. The tents were functional, but far from sterile, and the operating rooms were basically partitioned corners with enough light to see what you were cutting. Within 48 hours, we were taking casualties from a convoy hit by an IED. That night, I knelt in gravel, stabilizing a chest wound, knees, digging into the dirt dust, sticking to the sweat on my arms. Somewhere beyond the blast walls, small arms fire cracked in reply. I wasn't armed. My weapon was my hands, and they had to be steadier than the ground beneath me. We worked until our backs ached, our gloves stuck to our skin, and the air in the tent tasted like iron. We lost one that night, saved 3. The ratio haunted me, less than the idea of what it would have been without us there. By the end of my first month, I'd learned the rhythm of the place. Choppers meant movement. Runners meant urgency. Silence after a radio call meant bad news. We patched up Marines, Afghan soldiers, even civilians caught in the wrong street at the wrong time. In the moment, it didn't matter whose uniform they wore. Bleeding is universal. I wrote home in brief, factual sentences. Busy here. Working on everything from shrapnel to burns. Long days. Dad would reply with updates about the weather back home, about Mark's latest field exercise, about nothing that touched where I was or what I was doing. He never asked what it felt like to work under fire. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe he assumed I wasn't. But I was. 2 months in a mortar landed close enough to knock tools off the surgical table. We didn't stop. One of the surgeons just swore under his breath and said, "Keep going." We did. That's when I realized that for all the debates about what counted as combat, none of them mattered here. This was a fight we were just fighting for a different outcome. By the end of the tour, I'd stopped wondering if Dad would ever see it that way. The truth was simple. You don't have to fire a shot to be in the thick of it. You just have to stay when every instinct says to run. When the orders came for my second deployment, there was no hesitation. I signed before the ink on the packet was dry. This time, I wasn't assigned to a fixed surgical site. I was embedded directly with an infantry unit. That meant convoys, foot patrols, and a front row seat to the worst days a soldier can have. The med kit on my back became as familiar as my own shadow. It was heavy, but so was the responsibility. Every time we moved out, I memorized the faces around me, knowing that at any point I might have to keep one of them alive until we could get them to extraction. Afghanistan in the field was different from Afghanistan in the tent. Out there, dust coated everything, weapons, skin, even thoughts. The air tasted of diesel and tension. You slept in short, shallow intervals, always listening for the sound that meant move. 3 weeks into that second tour, we took fire while crossing a wadi. A private went down hard, leg torn open. I dropped into the dirt beside him, feeling rounds snap overhead. My rifle stayed slung. My hands worked the wound, packing gauze while yelling for cover fire. He lived because we got him on the bird in time. I still remember the look in his eyes as they lifted him out, pain and relief in equal measure. By my third tour, I was leading a combat medical response team during Operation Mountain Shield. We moved fast sometimes ahead of the main force to set up aid points where they'd be needed before anyone got hit. It was chess played in real terrain, and it meant reading the battle almost as quickly as the commanders. The moment that defined that tour wasn't in the official report the way it happened in my head. A platoon was pinned down by machine gun fire in a narrow valley. One of their sergeants took a round to the chest plate that fractured ribs and knocked the wind and fight out of him. I moved in under covering fire, pulled him behind a rock outcropping, and worked in a space barely big enough to turn my shoulders. When we got him breathing steady again, I looked up to see the platoon leader watching me like I'd just rewritten the rules. Later, he told me, "I've seen combat medics work, but never like that. You didn't just save him, you steadied all of us." Back home, those deployments turned into thin bullet points on my service record. To my father, they were just more time over there. Mark's stories about firefights still drew the bigger audience. But something had shifted in me. I stopped hoping my father would see what I'd done. I didn't need him to stamp it with approval. The men and women I served with knew. The ones who'd been on the ground knew. And one day that truth was going to stand in the open where no one could talk around it. The ballroom was the kind of space designed for banquets and fundraisers, polished wood floors, high ceilings, and round tables dressed in white linen. But tonight, the air carried the weight of something older and heavier than social niceties. The walls were lined with service flags, and every few minutes, you'd hear the low rumble of veterans greeting each other like long-lost brothers. I had been invited weeks earlier, the letter formal and direct, "You are to be recognized," for distinguished service during 3 combat tours in Afghanistan. My seat was near the front in the honoree section. My father's was a table over surrounded by men he'd served with decades ago. I caught snippets of their conversation over the hum of the room deployments, old units, how things aren't the same anymore. Then I heard it, clear, almost casual. "She never fought in combat," my father said. Not cruel, just matter of fact, like he was stating the weather. And because of who he was and who he was speaking to, they nodded along. I didn't turn around. I'd learned that sometimes the most effective response is to let a person's words hang long enough for reality to catch up to them. Tonight, reality wasn't far behind. The MC's voice rose above the chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program will begin shortly." A color guard marched in boots, striking the floor in perfect rhythm. The national anthem swelled, and the entire room stood in unison. I sang quietly, my voice steady. Then came the introductions. One by one, the honorees were called, each greeted with applause and a handshake from the presiding general. The citations were brief, but heavy with meaning years of service, compressed into sentences that spoke volumes to anyone who had worn the uniform. When they reached my name, the general didn't look down at his notes. Major Lauren Hayes, United States Army. Forward surgical and field attachments across 3 combat tours in Afghanistan. Bronze Star for Valor. Combat Medical Badge. Distinguished Service in Operation Mountain Shield. For a moment, there was no sound. Then the applause started, not polite, but resonant, spreading across the room like a tide. I stood my dress uniform, crisp metals catching the light. As I walked to the stage, I passed my father's table. This time, I let my eyes flick toward him just long enough to see his jaw tighten and his gaze drop. His friends had all turned toward me, their expressions shifting in real time as the words they'd heard collided with the truth in front of them. On stage, the general shook my hand. His grip was firm, his eyes steady. "Well done, Major," he said low enough for only me to hear. I didn't give a speech. I didn't need to. The citation had said everything that mattered. When I stepped down from the stage, the applause was still rolling, not swelling, not fading, just holding. That steady, even respect felt more solid than any ovation I'd ever heard. I returned to my seat, the plaque balanced on my lap, its polished surface cool under my fingers. I didn't look toward my father again, but I could feel the shift. Not in him necessarily, in the space around him. The table that had nodded along earlier was quieter now, their conversations muted. They had heard the same facts as everyone else, and facts don't need defense. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of names and service records. I applauded for each one, my hands moving in time with the rest of the room. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying the way the general's voice had carried my record into the open. No embellishment, no spin. Afterward, people filtered toward the exits, stopping to shake hands, trade stories, or take photos. A young medic, maybe 21, 22 at most, stepped into my path. His uniform was new enough that the creases still held. "Ma'am?" he said. "I just wanted to say, I didn't know medics did all that. I didn't know until tonight." I smiled. "Now you do. And so will the people you serve with." Outside, the night air was cool, a relief after the heat of the lights inside. The parking lot was a scatter of tail lights and low conversation. I spotted my father standing with one of his old ranger buddies near the curb. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did, and chose not to meet my eye. Either way, I kept walking. It wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It wasn't about changing his mind. It was about knowing that the truth had been spoken where it mattered, and nothing could take it back. Somewhere behind me, laughter broke out, not unkind, just the sound of people moving on to the next thing. And that was fine. My story wasn't meant to end with a confrontation. It was meant to stand like the record it was for anyone willing to read it. In the car, I rested the plaque in the passenger seat, the way you do with something fragile. The dashboard light caught the engraving, throwing the words into sharp relief. 3 tours, Bronze Star, Combat Medical Badge. Not a single one of those lines required my defense. Facts don't need defense. If you've ever had someone underestimate your service, your work, or your worth, let this be your reminder: the truth will stand without permission. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe in honoring all who serve, subscribe so their stories are never forgotten.